The moment Alexander walked in early, his perfect life shattered, because the woman he trusted most was capable of cruelty he never imagined. The story opens with the sensory details of wealth turned sinister, the whisper of Italian leather on marble interrupted by the sharp crack of flesh meeting flesh. It establishes the jarring contrast between Alexander's expectation of his sanctuary and the shocking tableau of violence he discovers, his impeccably dressed wife standing over a terrified child in a pink dress, her beautiful face contorted with raw, unfiltered hatred. Alexander's key was still in the lock when he heard it, the high-pitched whimper of a child in pain. He pushed through the door to find his wife standing in the center of their living room, the afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and illuminating what looked like a scene from a nightmare. Ruth Johnson, barely 7 years old, was curled on the marble floor in her bright pink dress, her small hands raised defensively above her head. Shards of crystal from a shattered water pitcher lay scattered around her like diamonds of accusation. Camilla stood over the child, still holding the braided leather riding crop that normally hung decoratively near the fireplace, her chest rising and falling with exertion. "Camilla?" Alexander's voice cut through the silence. His wife's head snapped toward him, and for a fraction of a second, he saw something feral in her eyes before she composed herself. She lowered the crop and smoothed her blonde hair with one perfectly manicured hand. "Darling, you're home early," she said, her voice shifting into the honeyed tone she used at fundraisers. "I caught this little thing playing where she doesn't belong. She knocked over my grandmother's pitcher, the baccarat crystal, Alexander. The one from the estate auction." Ruth remained motionless on the floor, her small body trembling. A thin line of blood traced from her temple down her cheek. Alexander's stomach turned as he noticed the dark red welts already forming on the child's exposed arms. "Get up, Ruth," Camilla commanded, her voice sharp again. "Explain to Mr. Whitmore what you were doing in here when you're supposed to be in the kitchen with your mother." Alexander watched his wife's transformation with growing horror. It was seamless, practiced, the kind of pivot he'd seen desperate executives make when caught falsifying reports to investors. Camilla's face softened into an expression of wounded concern, her hand reaching out to touch his arm with theatrical delicacy. "I know how this must look, darling, but you have to understand. I've been lenient with Aaliyah, letting her bring Ruth to work, but the child has sticky little fingers. Just last week, I found her in our bedroom, going through my jewelry box. I didn't want to upset you with it, but this has been ongoing." She gestured dramatically at the broken pitcher, then at Ruth, who had finally managed to pull herself into a sitting position, her pink dress stained with water and spotted with blood. "I was simply trying to teach her boundaries, Alexander. Children like her need firm guidance, or they grow up thinking they can take whatever they want." Camilla's voice carried that particular edge of righteousness she employed when defending her charity board decisions to cut funding for inefficient programs. But Alexander had built a $340 million empire by reading people, by seeing through polished presentations to the rot beneath. He recognized the performance because he'd witnessed it 100 times in boardrooms, the caught executive suddenly becoming the concerned whistleblower, the fraudulent partner transforming into the wounded victim. Camilla's pupils were still dilated with adrenaline. Her knuckles were white around the riding crop she'd yet to put down. "Camilla," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same lethal calm he used before firing senior executives, "go to your mother's house. Now." "What?" "Alexander, you can't possibly." "Now." The weekend house was silent after Camilla left, her Mercedes peeling out of the driveway with an indignant screech of tires. Alexander knelt beside Ruth, who was still sitting on the floor, her eyes fixed on the scattered crystal as if it might explode again. Her small hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned ashen. "Ruth, sweetheart, I need to make sure you're not badly hurt. May I look at your arms?" The child flinched but didn't pull away when he gently took her wrist. What he discovered made bile rise in his throat. The welts from the riding crop were fresh and angry, but beneath them were older marks, fingerprint-shaped bruises in various stages of healing, some yellow-green, others still purple-black. On her left forearm, partially hidden by her sleeve, was a circular mark that could only be a burn. The edges were raised and healing, perhaps 2 weeks old. Ruth's breathing had become rapid and shallow, her eyes darting toward the hallway where her mother would be working. She still hadn't spoken a word. Alexander's hands shook as he examined her. How had he missed this? How many times had he walked past this child, smiled absently at her, and never noticed that she flinched when adults moved too quickly? He'd been so consumed with acquisition deals and development projects that he'd made himself blind to the suffering happening under his own roof. "Does your mama know about these?" he asked gently. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but her small jaw set with a determination that broke his heart. She shook her head once, sharply. The message was clear: she was protecting her mother from something, and Alexander was beginning to understand what that something was. Aaliyah Johnson moved through the kitchen with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible. Alexander watched her hands shake as she wiped down counters that were already spotless, her eyes never quite meeting his. When he'd asked her to sit down and talk with him, she'd actually looked terrified. "Ms. Johnson, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. You won't lose your job, and I promise you're safe. But I have to know what's been happening to Ruth." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Aaliyah's fingers twisted in her apron, and Alexander could see her internal struggle, the terror of speaking warring with 3 years of accumulated pain. When she finally broke, it came out in a flood. It started small, Mr. Whitmore. Comments about how Ruth needed to know her place and not get ideas above her station. Then Mrs. Whitmore began making Ruth clean messes that didn't exist, scrub floors that were already clean. She'd make her do it over and over until her hands bled. Aaliyah's voice cracked. The slurs came next. Words I won't repeat. She'd call Ruth those names and then dare me to say something, daring me to complain. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. 6 months ago, Mrs. Whitmore told me she had proof I was stealing, photographs of your jewelry in my room. She said she'd call immigration, that she'd make sure I was deported and Ruth would end up in foster care. She said, no one will believe a black maid over a Whitmore. So I stayed quiet. I let her. Aaliyah's composure shattered entirely. I let her hurt my baby because I was too scared to fight back. With Aaliyah's trembling permission, Alexander followed her to the small quarters behind the kitchen that served as her apartment. The space was immaculate, a single room with a neatly made bed, a small desk where Ruth did her homework, and a dresser with a framed photo of Aaliyah's late mother. Everything spoke of dignity maintained despite circumstances designed to strip it away. She told me not to lock this drawer, Aaliyah said, her voice barely above a whisper as she opened the bottom dresser. Said she needed to be able to check that I wasn't hoarding things from the main house. Inside, nestled among folded clothes, was a velvet jewelry pouch. Alexander recognized it immediately. It was from the set Camilla kept in their bedroom safe. Aaliyah lifted it with 2 fingers as if it might burn her. I've never touched these, Mr. Whitmore. I swear on my daughter's life. I came back from grocery shopping 2 months ago and found them here. I was too terrified to move them, too terrified to tell you. I thought if I touched them, it would prove whatever Mrs. Whitmore was trying to prove. Alexander opened the pouch. Inside were a diamond tennis bracelet, a pair of emerald earrings, and a sapphire pendant, easily $50,000 worth of jewelry, all pieces Camilla had reported as misplaced to him months ago. He'd assumed she'd simply forgotten where she'd stored them. Now he understood. She'd been building a criminal case against a woman whose only crime was existing in a space Camilla considered exclusively hers. The calculated cruelty of it staggered him. This wasn't mere abuse, it was a systematic campaign of terror with legal consequences as the nuclear option. Margaret Chen's office in the financial district was lined with awards, Prosecutor of the Year, Civil Rights Attorney of the Decade, commendations from 3 different advocacy organizations. She listened to Alexander's account with the intense focus of a former federal prosecutor, taking notes on a legal pad while he laid out everything he discovered. When he finished, she set down her pen and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and steel. "Mr. Whitmore, what your wife has done isn't just morally reprehensible. It's criminal on multiple fronts. The assault of a minor, obviously. But the planted evidence combined with immigration threats constitutes extortion and possibly human trafficking under federal law. The forced labor beyond contracted hours, the threats to separate a mother from her child, these are the tactics of traffickers, not employers." Alexander felt the full weight of his ignorance crushing down on him. "I should have seen it. I should have. You can't change the past, but you can document the present." Margaret leaned forward. "Here's what we're dealing with, your wife is smart. She's built a paper trail that makes Aaliyah look like a thief. If we move too quickly, she'll destroy evidence, coach witnesses, and pivot to making you the villain. She might even file first, claiming you were complicit. What do we need? Proof of her intent, preferably in her own words. Medical records documenting Ruth's injuries with timestamps that correlate with when you were traveling. The planted jewelry photographed in situ. Security footage if you have it. And most importantly, we need her to confess to someone she trusts, thinking she's one." Margaret's eyes held a glint that reminded Alexander why she'd never lost a case. "Can you get that for me, Mr. Whitmore?" The Peninsula Hotel suite cost $800 a night, but Alexander barely noticed the luxury as he sat with his laptop, watching the live feed from his home security system. He'd told Camilla he was flying to New York for an emergency acquisition meeting. She'd sounded almost gleeful on the phone when he'd called to tell her, her voice dripping with false sympathy about his stressful schedule. Now, watching her pour wine in their kitchen, he waited. Margaret had explained that people like Camilla needed to gloat, needed to share their victories. It was Wednesday evening, her usual time to call her sister, Victoria. Right on schedule, Camilla's phone rang. She answered on speaker, her voice bright with triumph. "Victoria? Oh, darling, you won't believe how perfectly this is going. Alexander's in New York, probably signing papers and thinking he's building his empire, completely oblivious to the fact that I'm about to take half of everything he owns." Alexander's hand clenched around his water glass as he listened. "The little monkey finally gave me the ammunition I needed. Alexander caught me disciplining her, and now he thinks I'm some kind of monster. Perfect. My lawyer says we can spin this as me having a breakdown from the stress of being married to an absent workaholic. We'll paint him as so consumed with business that he let abuse happen under his own roof. Negligence, possible complicity, it's all on the table." Victoria's laughter came through the speaker. "And the maid? The second the divorce is filed, I'm calling ICE with the photos of my jewelry in her room. She'll be deported, the kid will be in foster care, and there goes our only witnesses. By the time Alexander figures out what happened, he'll be paying me alimony and I'll be in Paris." The restaurant was called Atelier Crane, 3 Michelin stars and a 6-month waiting list that Alexander's assistant had bypassed with a single phone call. Camilla arrived in a crimson dress that probably cost more than Aaliyah made in 3 months, her smile radiant as she kissed Alexander's cheek like nothing had changed between them. "Darling, I'm so glad you wanted to talk," she purred, settling into her chair. "I've been absolutely devastated by our disagreement. I know I was harsh with the child, but surely you can understand the stress I've been under." Alexander had worn a wire exactly twice in his business career, both times to catch executives engaged in fraud. The device under his suit jacket felt like a burning coal against his skin, but his expression remained neutral as he poured her wine. "I've been thinking about what you said, Camilla. About boundaries and maintaining standards in our home." Her eyes lit up, she thought she was winning. "Exactly. I knew you'd understand once you thought about it rationally. These people need structure, Alexander. Aaliyah's been with us for 3 years, and she still hasn't learned basic respect for our property. And letting her bring that child, well, it was a mistake from the beginning. Tell me more about how you've been managing things," Alexander said carefully, his phone angled just right in his breast pocket. On a secured channel, Margaret Chen, family court judge Harold Martinez, and Chronicle reporter Sarah Kim were listening to everything. Over the next hour, Camilla laid it all out. The teaching moments with Ruth that were actually beatings. The planted jewelry. The immigration threats. The lawyer who'd advised her on how to maximize her divorce settlement by documenting Alexander's absences and building a case for his emotional abandonment. She never noticed his phone's camera light. She never heard her own destruction being recorded and broadcast to the very people who could dismantle her life. The arrest happened at 10:47 a.m. on a Thursday, right in the middle of Camilla's Pilates class at the exclusive Pacific Heights Athletic Club. 2 San Francisco police officers walked in while she was on the reformer, read her rights in front of 14 socialites, and escorted her out in handcuffs. By noon, the video of her confession had been shared with every major news outlet and was making the rounds in San Francisco's elite circles. By 2 p.m., she'd been removed from the board of the Children's Hospital Foundation, the San Francisco Ballet, and the Museum of Modern Art. Her membership at the club was revoked by 4 p.m. By evening, her lawyer had issued a statement calling the recording illegally obtained, a claim that Margaret Chen demolished in a press conference by explaining California's two-party consent laws and the public interest exception for confessions of ongoing criminal conspiracy. The trial 6 months later lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming: medical records documenting Ruth's injuries, Aaliyah's testimony, the planted jewelry, the recorded confession. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Camilla Ashford Whitmore was sentenced to 3 years in prison for assault of a minor, extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted human trafficking. She was also ordered to pay $500,000 in damages to Aaliyah and Ruth Johnson, money that Alexander privately tripled when he established the Ruth Johnson Foundation for protecting domestic workers' rights. On the courthouse steps after the sentencing, Alexander knelt beside Ruth, who was wearing another pink dress, this one bought by her mother with money from her new job as the foundation's director of community outreach. "Mr. Whitmore," Ruth said, her voice stronger than he'd ever heard it, "when I grow up, I want to be a lawyer. To help kids like me." Alexander looked at this brave child who'd survived what should have broken her and felt something shift in his chest, the first real purpose he'd felt in years. "Then that's exactly what you'll be, Ruth. I promise you that." And Alexander Whitmore, who'd built an empire on keeping promises, intended to keep this one most of all.